Thank you, Stephen Mbide, for bringing us up to speed with the situation across the streets in industrial area. Something that tells of the dire state of the country there when motorists are waiting up to 2 hours just to make a decision on whether to go or return home or look for an alternative route. That is daunting. We shall be making that a subject of a discussion in our Kickstarter a little bit later. But before I introduce my guests for the discussion, let me just give you a preamble about Sub-Saharan Africa regional outlook and the funding squeeze by donors that could be well responsible for the lack of financial resources to deal with infrastructure projects, including the building and maintaining of roads within the city that you are seeing. Growth in Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to slow to 3.6% as a big funding squeeze goes on before rebounding to 4.2% in 2024, in line with global recovery, a subsiding inflation, and a winding down in monetary policy tightening tied to the drying up of aid and access to private finance that is hitting the region. This is the second successive year of an aggregate decline in Sub-Saharan Africa growth. Between 2020 and 2022, the International Monetary Fund provided more than $50 billion to the region, more than twice the amount disbursed in any 10-year period since the 1990s. As of March 2023, the IMF had lending arrangements with 21 countries with more requests under consideration. The IMF, together with stakeholders, held a meeting on Monday at Muhire University Business School to navigate the funding space that is narrowing for the region. And Dr. Fred Muhumuza, an economist, and Francis Muhire, both analysts in their own stead, are here to help us understand what the discussion was all about and how the resolutions or the ideas that came out of it shall be able to condition the kind of way forward that the nation ought to get onto. A very warm welcome to the program, Dr. Fred Muhumuza and Mr. Muhire.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Higenyo.
Before we go into the nitty-gritty of the funding squeeze and Sub-Saharan Africa's region economic outlook and how the IMF is not or is doing everything to ensure that we stay afloat, here in Kampala, the footage we've been seeing, as Stephen Mbide reported live from industrial area, to me is the perfect description of an economy. Am I wrong, Dr. Fred Muhumuza?
Well, you may not be wrong, I'm afraid, because even by our own description as the country, remember for the last 2 decades, we have been amplifying, more than 2 decades now, the need for infrastructure as an anchor for economic growth and many other things. And Uganda has put quite lots of money, billions of dollars, in road infrastructure, and energy infrastructure, in ICT, literally speaking to that space of movement of people, goods, and whatever else needs to be moved. Data is important for the economy. Now, it's a pity that having put all those resources in there, we again find ourselves where we are. And this is not just a Kampala situation. I've been hearing people say, but there are some good roads. No, you know, we don't look at one road, we look at a road network. Those guys you've just seen on 6th Street, 7th Street, 8th Street, don't sleep on that road.
That's right.
They came from somewhere. So if there is one bad road somewhere, it can actually nullify all the other good roads that you have. It can slow down progress. These are fellows, the gentleman is saying he was there by 6:45. That's almost 2 hours, 1 hour ago. He had what he wanted to do. The story can be the same for everybody within that situation. It can be worse for somebody who is trying to get a truck of matoke, trying to get a truck of maize or rice from deep within the villages into the Kampala markets, into Sudanese markets, all those kinds of things. So you begin to see the gravity of the situation, that is not only the roads here we are discussing, because of the nature of the implications of the state of the roads on the rest of the economy, it eventually translates into an economic issue, as you have rightly put it.
A translation into an economic issue, Francis Muhire, is down to the cost that the motorists have to meet the losses that they make, which ultimately translates into the inability to do business, which affects taxation and other returns. When you look at incidents like the one that we've just seen, well, we know it is deplorable, just like Fred Muhumuza has said, but is there the possibility of urgency to work on it?
Thank you, Chris. Just as Dr. Fred has put it, in fact, when you look at, you can look at potholes, on the load, or on the loads or any other infrastructure, but there are potholes actually in every sector in this country right now. I want to show you that even when you go to the health sector, you're going to find that, for example, the public health facilities have not been, being stocked in terms of, let's say, drugs for the last 5 months. When you look at, for example, the education sector, you're going to see that the expenditure per capita on the education sector has also been reducing drastically. So there are many potholes, actually. There are potholes in all the sectors within the economy. But what does this lead to, as we've talked about the costs? I mean, if you're a motorist and you haven't lost a shock absorber, then you're lucky. And that, that increases an expenditure from, spending on such a thing. The same thing, whether it's health sector, people, are spending, to buy or access drugs outside the public health facility. So the cost is high, and this erodes actually the disposable income that is left, when it comes to, let's say, households and even the businesses in general. So the cost is really high, and all I can say is that the government actually should look at, for example, fixing these roads, as something that needs urgency, because the cost is really immense if they are not fixed. Okay. Yeah.
Talking about fixing roads could be down to the fact that a lot more problems, like you say, across all sectors need to be fixed as national problems. The funding squeeze could be one that government could readily attribute to failure to effectively be able to work and be able to roll out the kind of infrastructure that the average Ugandan needs. Sometimes we blame the donors, the donor community, long after COVID has been, dealt with. The conference that was held at Muhire University Business School that involved the International Monetary Fund, did you both attend?
Yeah,
you attended. You did attend.
Yes, I attended.
Just before we discuss, just take me through what was the thrust and what were the issues that emerged, especially when it comes to resolutions.
Yeah, thank you. Really, you do not have new resolutions, but emphasis.
Emphasis.
A lot of these things have been discussed. And when you hear people talk about COVID and the need that we had to borrow to address COVID, it's partly true, because the situation that was being discussed began much earlier than COVID. The situation that the sub-Saharan Africa is facing began much earlier, because you're looking at Euro bonds, the debts that African countries, sub-Saharan African countries, picked from Europe, and they are now the ones coming to haunt them at this point. A country like Ghana, as we know, they defaulted. But Ghana began borrowing way back in 2008 and 9 when they discovered their oil.
Yeah.
Kenya has been borrowing, Zambia has been borrowing, and these are the countries facing the problem. So we don't want to entirely put it on COVID, because COVID may have worsened by a situation that was already bad, or getting bad, because the bad thing about debt is to build the momentum. And that was really the conversation that the IMF was bringing to sub-Saharan Africa. They even make a projection of which countries whose debt is going to spike, literally to move into severe situations in 2024 and in 2025. And in category of 2024, the bulk of it is going to be Kenya. So while we are watching Kenya having problems, in 2024 their problems may get worse. And moving beyond that, then it comes in South Africa in 2025. Now, the reason I'm raising these countries, one, because they were signaled out as countries that are going to have a big spike, but also they are major for the growth of Africa and this region.
That's right.
If anything happens to Kenya, it's going to
affect the rest
Uganda,
of East Africa region.
This kind of region. So it's no longer a question of debt to GDP ratio, and you're looking at yourself. It's not only a question of debt service that I'm incurring as a country. You also need to look over and say, what is my neighbor doing? We're having a conversation here because part of the biggest export destinations, you have Kenya, you have South Sudan, you have the DRC. Now, each of these countries is having pressures. South Sudan still has a lot of instability as a country. DRC has a war. Kenya now has a debt problem. So Uganda is going to get a lot of implications on that now. The implications may translate in many things. The potholes in all the sectors that we've talked about, but also looking through the warnings that came through this discussion, where the global picture. We have rising interest rates at the global level. And this is where we have been getting money. We have dwindling aid money from the traditional funders that we always know, the development partners. They are having now significant problems. These are the countries that are also getting financial squeezes, but also they are getting refugees. We have so many refugees from Ukraine who have moved into Europe. So they have a lot of things on their own that they have to resolve, and their interest rates are also rising. So that was one of the caution that was coming through, that money from those sources is going to continue reducing. Now, what money is going to be available? Non-concessional debt. That comes at a bigger cost.
Bigger cost, yeah.
And it's really commercial debt. You may not even get the chance to come and use it. So it was pointing to those areas. And this is not just for government, it's also for the private sector.
For private sector.
Because we know a lot of private sector have been borrowing through their partnerships. And if their partnerships are stressed, they're also going to be stressed. So really it was a warning. And as you have indicated, the IMF lending $50 billion in the last 2 years, more than what it has done in almost in the last 3 decades. People need to understand that the IMF is not a development bank like you would say the African Development Bank or the World Bank. The IMF comes in to stabilize. So if they have ramped up that much money, it means there was a lot of instability in the region, which they have calmed down. Now, if this instability continues, as I've indicated, so many countries are even having conversations with the IMF. So the moment you see IMF increasing its presence, then you know there is a lot of instability, because that is really its core, to stabilize the global financial system and countries. So you have a danger on your reserves, and the IMF will come in to try and keep those reserves. But the only sustainable of maintaining your reserves is through production, that you can be able to export and you can be able to import less.
We shall be dealing with that a little bit later, on what measures can be put in place to address those challenges that the IMF seeks to help us overcome. Francis, you said you also attended that particular meeting or discourse that happened at Mubs. When I listened to Fred Muhumuza, it's a case of the International Monetary Fund and partners seeking to roll out a new dispensation when it comes to funding. They are aware that it cannot stop, but there must be some kind of streamlining somewhere in order to allow countries actually deal with the problem, because if left to our own devices, we could borrow ourselves into untold debt.
Yes, thank you. You know, attending actually the whole event, you would see that IMF is simply sending a signal out there that the situation at the global stage is really bad.
Really bad.
And if it is really this bad, you as sub-Saharan countries expect the worst, because you're at that lowest level in terms of development. So you're the most vulnerable in this whole situation. So the global picture I got is that when you look at, for example, the global financial system, it is in total chaos. There is a crisis. And this is explained by so many factors, but some of the most outstanding factors, I would say, geopolitics and geoeconomics, given what is happening in the whole world. And then this increases actually the uncertainty. So this has pushed investors to think twice, even those actually who can be able to provide non-concessional loans. But beyond that, there is something huge. I feel there's something huge that is happening globally, and this is actually to do with the total change of systems. You know, from World War II, we saw a lot of things changing in the financial system. And today, as you talk of, let's say, the globalization, the end of petrodollar, then the geoeconomics, we are talking about, all these things are indicating one thing, that the financial system globally, we might wake up one day and it has changed completely. Because today when you look at...
I hope we don't wake up and there is no money across the globe.
It is going to happen, and that's why I'm taking you. Today, if you look at, for example, the rate at which central banks and investors are buying gold is very alarming. However, this is a debate that is not actually in sub-Saharan Africa. It's more in developed economies and emerging economies. For example, just in the second quarter of 2022, over 35% of gold purchased was actually bought by central banks across the world. These are developed economies and emerging markets. And even investors. The question is, why are they rushing, to buy gold or stock up gold? That is the financial system. I'm telling you that anytime you might wake up and it has changed. Because I want to remember that, for example, in 1945, that's when the US dollar was, put forward as the global reserve currency. And it was backed by gold by then. But 1970, we saw Richard Nixon coming in and ditching the gold standard. But we've seen, you have BRICS, you have emerging economies who have realized, why is it that the US dollar has to be the global reserve currency, So that's why you see, for example, the BRICS, especially the biggest oil producing countries, are like, no, we can accept money, let's say Chinese money. We don't have to be selling our oil in US dollar. They have realized that this whole system might go back to the gold standard. So even the investors that have access actually, or have the money that would offer out in terms of non-concession loans, they're also looking at investing in gold. The other thing, we've also saw USA increasing its interest rate on its securities. All the investors are rushing to invest in the US securities. So the IMF is sending a signal that the financial system is in a crisis. Sub-Saharan African countries, poor countries, your politicians, you better wake up.
Let me just keep it there before I come to Dr. Fred Muhumuza. When the IMF, you say, is indicating that things or the tectonic plates are shifting, this is in the best interest of the IMF. It will be foolhardy, and my apologies for using that word, for us to think that the International Monetary Fund is here so that we are propped to the best possible standards. So within our framework of a policy intervention, it could be interest rates, how to deal with them, and then the pressures on inflation, the drag on credit. Did this particular gathering come out with a concrete plan of action away from the warning system that is being shown by the IMF?
Just as Dr. Fred has put it, IMF is all about, making sure that macroeconomic, to ensure macroeconomic stability across the world. So if, for example, it, predicts that there's going to be, a big change, and this might affect mostly the sleeping, let's say, sub-Saharan African countries. Of course, any part of the world, no matter how small it is significant.
That's right.
IMF is trying to tell all its partners across the world that you have to wake up to the reality. The crisis is here. You have to stop, for example, this kind of fiscal indiscipline. You've been living this delusion of borrowing, because there is someone to lend, but things are going to change.
All right. Francis Muhire, economic analyst at, and of course one of the leading minds when it comes to issues economics. So Fred Muhumuza, I'll be returning to you very shortly, but I have been signaled by the producer that it's about time we go for a short break. It is, of course, the top of the hour of 8. We shall do exactly that and return and continue with the discussion. So do stay with us.
Boom. Feel the positive energy.
You're watching Morning at NTV.
Welcome back. We're glad you're still with us in our Kickstarter discussion. If you are just joining us, welcome on board. We are talking about Sub-Saharan Africa's regional economic outlook and the funding squeeze that is determining or not determining the amount of money that is coming through. Government has already expressed concerns that it's unable to roll out major projects because of the funding squeeze, and that some of the issues that you see, including the potholes that are swallowing cars, an entire truck being swallowed in a pothole. That, I believe, is a sinkhole, and I'm afraid across the city we could be having many sinkholes that are simply about or not just exposed. Let me return to my guests, Fred Muhumuza, renowned economist, and Francis Muhire, an economic analyst too. They attended a meeting that had the International Monetary Fund telling us, and I must be very categoric, we are spoken to most of the time. So the IMF was telling us it all doesn't look good, and we're going to have to ensure that we stay in line, or otherwise we could find ourselves in economic murky waters. Fred Muhumuza, where do we go forward? Emphasis has been made on what can be done by African countries and Uganda in particular to address some of these concerns, but for how long shall we emphasize solutions that are known, that are practical, but haven't been heeded to?
I think that's what really the key messages, one of the key messages that come through is you don't want to lose an opportunity of a crisis. Sometimes we act when a crisis emerges, but that does not mean you did not know earlier. So like you've mentioned, we have been having a conversation of debt and its implications on economies for quite some time. Some of us, you can get back in time for a decade or so, when we began flagging the implication of the rising debt. And most people were saying, we need to invest in infrastructure, of a sort of infrastructure, we need social services. But even as you do that, we had that same situation in the 90s. We managed to pull the economy through in the 90s by balancing the debt that we had, including negotiations for people to forgive us the debt. But you do kind of planned investments. You don't just attack all your problems at the same time when you have limited resources, which was the question of prioritization. If there is an emergency that comes in and you want to address it, you must cut the budget of somebody else. You don't go borrowing to say there is a new problem here, so I need to borrow. So how did we tackle COVID? How have we tackled the infrastructure investments? You are having investment in education, in health, in all of them at the same time. And you want to do all the roads, and all the roads to be tarmac. And underlying that is a situation really of poor governance and institution and corruption. So you have a very high cost. The unit cost for doing anything in Uganda is quite high. So we argued that the institutional reforms we also need to do, just not ramping up budgets, so that you get efficiency measures, that from the money that I have, I can go so far. Now, to do that, you would require to deal with the corruption issues, and I think these are some of the conversations that came in into the how would we go forward. You need to restructure government. You are not going to find an endless pot of money. That pot has ended. And you still need to fix your roads.
That's right.
So where is that money going to come from? Going out there to borrow, this is not the right time. Because the interest rates are high, the money is limited. You're already having to spend so much money on debt service. So you're really hemmed in from all angles, and it takes that creative thinking. Even if you increase revenue mobilization, 30% of your revenue, 25 to 30% of your revenue that you mobilize is actually going into debt management. So it's not going to speak to your current challenges. And yet you want to resolve those issues. And as we fail to resolve the issues, even the ability to mobilize the economy, to pay the debt, to pay taxes, and perform goes down. We are looking at a recovery of possibly 6% in the medium term, 6% growth. But 6% growth is already too low. Uganda needs to double digit. So these conversations have been around, but what we don't want to lose out is now, the situation we are in really makes it urgent for everybody to say action must be taken now. And we're hoping that action will be taken, and we can restructure, we can do some balancing to say, if I'm going to give a supplementary to so and so because the road situation is bad, then I must lower somebody's budget. You're not going to be a debate on raise more money through more borrowing. We have already hit a dead end in those aspects. Vehicle fleet, when are we going to resolve some key government spending areas? And say, Mr. Government, trim your expenditure because we don't have options. There are also options at policy level, at macroeconomic policy level. We might have to let the shilling lose value a little bit.
Interesting.
To curb the pressure to import, but also to put some value in the exports.
Already we are in a situation where we think the shilling is not doing well.
No, that's actually the...
To suggest that again we sink it further.
But you want to ask, where should it be? What is well for the shilling? Is 3,700 good? Because if you keep it at 3,700 and you have to import a lot of things, you're going to run down your reserves. Because remember, the economy is supposed to generate the dollars is strained by these problems we are seeing already. So if you can't get in the dollars, you can't even borrow to beef up your reserves. Borrowing to beef up reserves should be temporary. as you plan on your long-term strategy. The long-term strategy might be let the shilling lose value a little bit. So we're going to get into those unpopular decisions and policy measures, and the public needs to understand them, that if you're in a bad situation, you are not going to continue having feeling good factor.
Okay.
You have to face the realities and move on.
You agree with that?
Well, I think that is open for debate,
Okay.
but absolutely he's right given his explanation. But what I can say about Uganda's exchange rate, already the shilling has already depreciated.
Yeah.
The only thing that has kept it strong is actually because of the borrowing we've been doing. So we've been actually borrowing just to make sure that our shilling is stable, not because our exports have increased whether in quantity or quality. So, but then to go back to the main question here is that, as I said, that there is a massive change that is happening globally in the financial sector. And as Doctor has put it, this requires everyone to act in their own capacities. But starting with the government, you know, because we've talked about all the policy recommendations the government can take, and they are not being taken, or you have to question how they are being taken. The whole thing the whole question goes to the quality of the leaders. And I'm talking about politicians, I'm talking about policymakers. At the end of the day, these are the people that they will make. Technocrats, I really want to give it technocrats. I feel they do their job, but at the end of the day, they are not decision makers. Yeah. So it all goes to the quality of the leadership you have in, let's say, Uganda or the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. Because if we continue running business like we are, if we continue running economies like we are running a kiosk, I'm telling you, I won't wake up and it will be too late. As I said, this whole change that is happening globally in the financial system, if you don't pause and see what is really happening and prepare for it, or even try to maximize the opportunities, because as Doctor has said, yes, there is a crisis, but there are opportunities. That's why I'm like, for example, if all developed economies and emerging markets are rushing to buy, stock up their gold, yes. Yeah. You as sub-Saharan Africa, actually, who are actually producing much of this gold, what are you doing? Yeah. Uganda, as we speak, we are the 35th largest gold exporting country, though much of the gold is actually
instead of holding onto it, we are letting it
though
go.
Much of it, you can't even trace where it's coming from, whether it's coming from Uganda or
we are exporters, we are not producers.
We are exporters. So how much are we keeping for ourselves? In case you wake up and you have a good standard financial system. So, but as I said, this all goes to the quality of leadership you have in a country.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to interject there. You spoke of something that twitched my thinking. We are running like a kiosk arrangement. Can you say that again?
When you look at sub-Saharan Africa, we are running economies like we are running kiosks.
Wow.
And I can repeat this 1,000 times.
Later today, or even in the next 36 hours, data is expected from the United States on inflation. And of course, the other day we had the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. He paused literally when he took a walk through the financial park. Investors were waiting for a lot more than what he gave them, but of course they will be looking at him. When you look at the Bank of Uganda and its ability to give confidence to investors and all actors within the economy on the way forward, some might say it is flattering to deceive. We do not get a lot of talk, direction, and the feel of what the markets ought to deal with in making some of these decisions. Do you want, or would you want, for example, the Bank of Uganda, and especially the deputy, since we don't have a substantive governor, to be a little bit more not outspoken, but to speak out and give a sense of confidence that things are okay? That is to you, Francis Muhire.
Definitely, the central bank has the powers to ensure that, yes, for example, the investment environment is stable. We can continue to run the economy. And when you come to Uganda, for example, I think we've been having a good recovery, rebound in terms of economic growth compared to other economies. It's something we really have to note and not take for granted. I mean, you see commercial banks registering profits, you know, so there is still that, you know, that stability. But the whole thing, the whole question we have to ask ourselves, where are we heading? What is going to happen next year? As Dr. Fred said, different economies, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, are being affected differently. And even the time factor is different. Today you might be doing a bit well, but then you don't know what is going to happen next year. But just the central bank, you know, will try to ensure the public or the investors in general that, yes, there is, you know, stability, we can continue moving forward. But if you see that on the global stage, there are clear signals that the crisis is on. You know, for example, some people will say we are not yet in recession. Others will say maybe we are getting into recession, but there is already a crisis globally. Because if you talk about, you know, inflation rate increasing, the cost of living is increasing, you know, the debt, the cost of borrowing is increasing. And these things are not only happening in poor countries, but also in developed economies. I mean, you look at USA, you have, you know, about 3 banks which have closed down. You have the CFB Bank, you have the First Republic, all closing down. This is a signal to the rest of the world that the financial system is in a crisis. If you're still in a better position, it may not last for more than even a day.
Wow. Yeah. That is a very damning assessment there. If it can't last for more than a day. I'm glad you're not a government official. Some investors would just go and get all their money out of our banks and take it out.
Actually, I'd say that, just as I've said, this is a global picture. Investors here in Uganda, they might be still in a better position. But as I told about, for example, on the global picture, we saw, for example, in the US, Warren Buffett selling, you know, over 50% of his stocks in his companies, getting the cash. You don't know where he's actually going to put that cash.
He actually has the largest pile of cash in the world.
I'm sure he's bought gold.
So exactly, he cannot hold the cash. It has to be gold.
Yeah.
So if you see those investors, you know, big investors, let's say in the US market doing that, it is a signal coming to the poor countries.
Okay. Fred Muhumuza, we are playing within a financial ecosystem across the globe that is, we are not fitted for purpose to work in a way that serves us best. And most of the time it's a case of finding what we can do in order to survive. Has that imperative sat well with the policymakers here to understand that it's about time we begin to work from our end and not to respond to what is happening on the other side? Because somebody will say, how can you not respond to a global economy that shapes most of what you're doing? But at the end of the day, if an ecosystem is to work for you, you've got to go into it with your advantages. Well,
yes. A very interesting question, really, that, as I said earlier, you are a small economy in a global space.
That's right.
You are not going to change that global space. Because you are a small economy.
You're very small, right?
You cannot say, now me, I have lowered my interest rate, and then people will come to invest. You are small, nobody sees you in some cases. There are people who don't know Uganda exists. There are people who think Uganda is a company. All sorts of things are out there. So you take that reality. But you say, I have to exist,
and
in
thrive.
this big space. The other day, the Swiss bank that collapsed and had to be bought by another one, that bank was worth $545 billion. The Ugandan economy is $45 billion. So you can really see that one bank in Switzerland was 10 times richer than the whole entire Ugandan economy. But that's the space you are playing in. And that's why I was saying, you don't want to say, why is the Uganda shilling losing value? The Uganda shilling is being part of that global system and is being hounded from all those global angles. So you don't want to say, I must preserve the value of my shilling when you are such a very tiny country. So if the pressures come and the storms come and hit the shilling, the only way you preserve the shilling is running down your reserves. Because now you must sell dollars, which dollars you don't have. The dollars is not your currency. And then we're saying now, what option do you have? As just mentioned, we have already been borrowing to kick up our reserves. Now, remember that borrowing we are doing now to stabilize the shilling using the reserves. In another 2 or 3 years, we have to pay back using the same reserves. So that's why I'm saying the best way to preserve your reserve, you might have to let your shilling take a new position. in order to survive the global pressures on yourself, because you can't stop them. That's one side that is going to be a policy conversation. And I would like the policy makers to take it on as the realities that we face. And as Francis has mentioned, the decisions are made by the politicians. But they make these decisions based on what the technocrats put before them. Mr. Museveni has been on record for saying, Mr. Mutebire told me this. So he took the decisions. In some cases, even thinks the late Mutebire misled him. I don't think that's true. Because looking back at the conditions of the 90s, there were no options. And thank God that when you present a good case, the politicians are ready to take a decision. So growth drivers, what do we see? As you've said, in some cases when the global situation is in a turbulent, you revert to your internal sources of growth. Can Ugandans, the domestic demand, drive our growth, where we can no longer rely on the turbulent storms out there? We have a very poor community. Countries like China now can tap into their internal dynamics because Chinese have a lot of savings.
That's right.
Malaysians have a lot of savings. Singaporeans have a lot of savings.
In fact, the latest data from China shows significant recovery and growth of the economy. Far up what they had projected, they've registered a lot more.
And as far back as when the first crisis hit us, the economic crisis, 2008, they began to say global headwinds are not going to be drivers of our growth. The Asian countries came up with a paper, which I've asked my students to read, to see how do we now tap our own Asian domestic demand and regional demand to grow our economies. Now you come to Uganda, how will you grow your economy? Using very poor people, as we have seen. Some countries have actually done these like Nabanja money, find money and pay out to the communities so that they can come and demand and then kickstart the industries.
Kickstart the industries.
Because the industries can't start if there is no market.
That's right.
So who should start that? This was a Keynesian discussion 100 years ago and still relevant today. So we need to get into those new spaces to say industrial parks are not going to drive growth in this country. A standard gauge rail is not going to drive growth in this country. It might, but that's a 10-year discussion away. What do we do in 2022, 2023, 2024? That's where you want to be putting your money. So those are going to be tough decisions that when you have no money, invest where you get the quick returns. We have pumped, struggling to put in 1 trillion under the Paris Development Model, financial inclusion pillar 3.
That always gets a little bit of trouble.
So that people can go and buy seedlings. But who is funding the seed multipliers? Because if they are going to go to the banks and borrow 25%, then the farmer will have to buy the seed at a very expensive rate. Or the seed might not be there. But even the farmer might produce with this kind of set of roads, you wonder whether the farmer will reach the market. So there are many things that are engulfing us, and we need to sit in a conversation to say, how do we tick the immediate boxes? Fine, you want to go to town, but there is a snake between you and the main road. That's right. You must first resolve that snake.
Francis Muhire, talking about ticking the right boxes and by having to look at what is happening, there is latest data from a subsidiary of a Standard Bank Group that puts Uganda at the top of a list of countries where doing business is favorable. And when you encounter such information and studies, the outlook is different from the reality. You know, people are grappling with all sorts of things. The private sector, there is a squeeze on credit. People are unable to afford or even access some of this money. And then there you are. A study comes up and tells you the best environment for doing business is in Uganda, yet we have local investors who are crying foul. They are not favored. The private sector on its own has a lot of money. If, for example, you see the telcos, and they have a mandate to give at least 1% of profits annually to a certain fund that helps rural communities adopt to new technologies, 1%. There was a time I saw the 1% of a telco, and it was in $1 trillion shillings. That means the 99%, after taxes have been paid and everything, the profits are shipped out. This is the private sector that ought to drive growth in order for us to be able to deal with the alternatives to the funding squeeze. Is there a possibility of holding them down and ensuring that most of this money actually stays within the economy and it provides the impetus for growth?
Yeah, it's interesting. In fact, Uganda, I think last evening, we won the award of being the best actually in terms of the best investment environment, and we came on top of all the East African countries.
That's emboldening information.
So these kind of studies are very interesting, but they should, as you've put it, these studies are showing something that you yourself you feel is not the reality on the ground. But this should actually trigger our minds about why do you think is actually driving the foreign investors feel like Uganda is the best country actually to invest in. You need to ask yourself about two factors. One, how is it for, let's say, an investor to repatriate his profit out of this country? We are talking about capital inflows and capital outflows that are not really strongly controlled. Now, investors like that.
There is a grave mismatch.
Investors like that because at the end of the day for them they are rational, they have come to invest. When they get their profits, they can even repatriate 100% of it. Foreign investors will come if you have an environment like that. They will take advantage of all the loopholes you have. But also the other factor you need to look at, globally when you look at most of multinationals coming into sub-Saharan Africa, they have learned one thing, that corruption is at its highest level in sub-Saharan African countries. So what they do, in fact, during their annual budgets, they put a certain amount that is going to take care of corruption.
Wait a minute. It's now official.
Most of the multinational companies, in their annual budgets, they put certain resources that is going actually to maximize that opportunity. You see, most of the countries, for example, if you're a national in their country like China and you're a corrupt official, you will be hanged. But if you're corrupt outside, China, it is okay because it is a benefit to them. So these are some of the things we need to ask ourselves, that these multinationals are not here to develop your country. That's the role of the government and its citizens. For them, they're here to make money. So as long as they know we can repatriate 100% of our profits, well, that is the market you want to go to. There is corruption. You can capitalize on it. That's where you want to go to. So some of these studies, when they show those results that you feel, in the public, or, in the eye of the public interest, is, opposing the reality, then these are the kind of things we need to think about.
Perhaps Dr. Fred Muhumuza is well suited to give us the distinction between the academic studies and the realities of the day. When you read these reports and then you counter firsthand the reality on the ground, I know as an economist perhaps you have developed the, can I call it the thick skin, not to be shocked or to be excited. But as a realist, and I'm sure it's a part of you, how do you move?
I think that's one of the challenges. We have really looked at these bank reports and some of them. They want to really show, because I want to show Uganda is a place to invest.
That is right.
Then once people come in, you will lend to them. So sometimes,
at a very high rate.
Yes, so sometimes you don't want to believe the reports of certain institutions without questioning the context. And as we've said, from the academia, we have come up to levels of questioning some of the formulas and approaches and methodologies used to come up with these conclusions. Now, when you look at, it is easy to register business in Uganda. So that scores very highly on business environment.
To an outsider.
But then we're also saying Uganda is one country where the mortality of business is very high.
It's very high.
Now, that doesn't speak to running a business. It speaks to registering it, but not running it. So a number of these reports, you want to question them because there are certain parameters they never bring in. Corruption, they are not going to factor it in because they are unable to pick governance weaknesses in their models. So they simply ignore that. And yet, as Francis has mentioned, it's a key thing. There are so many people. There are those who can put in a corruption provision in their budget, but there are those who will say, anywhere it is reported that I was involved in corruption, I lose global businesses. So these do self-exclusion because for them they are going to be judged by what is your governance and ethical standards as a business. Should we hear you pay the bribe in Vietnam, you lose all your businesses in the US, you lose all your businesses in Europe. So they do self-exclusion. So there are many we are not going to get here. And then I think private sector credit, that's one of the conversations we had, and I really want to appreciate the IMF for offering us at Mubs Economic Forum this opportunity to host this meeting. It came out from the Bank of Uganda. Dr. Adam Mugume raised the issue of private sector credit to GDP. In Uganda, it's just about 14%. globally, some countries are at 100%. So that means that financing in Uganda is still too low. The financial sector's role is very limited, which is why you give credit to these foreign investors who bring their money here and invest. Now, I have no problem even if they want to take their profit. The burden is on us. Why didn't you convince them to leave that profit here? Because they haven't seen an opportunity.
And that's where the loopholes
When they brought in their billions, you were happy to receive them. So when they take 1 billion as profit, it's okay.
Okay.
It's a business environment.
All right. Let's go for a break. When we return, we shall wrap up this conversation with a look at Uganda's investment posture across the globe, whether we are actually poised to be able to take in or receive in as much as return on investment is concerned. The discussion is Sub-Saharan Africa's regional economic outlook and the funding squeeze. Whether we can overcome the debt burden is another discussion. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
You're watching Morning at NTV.
All right, it's about time that we wrap this conversation up. We've been discussing Sub-Saharan Africa's regional economic outlook and the funding squeeze that is happening across the globe. Many of you have heard that you won't be receiving a certain amount of services, the best and prompt where you ought to, because the money is not there, and the guys who actually provide this money are also saying we do not have it, the taps are closing. With me in the studio are eminent economic analysts Francis Muhire and Fred Muhumuza. I'll give each 2 minutes, that's 120 broadcasting seconds, to give me and the audience what investment posture Uganda should now adopt to deal with the challenges that come from the funding squeeze and how best we can manage our appetite for borrowing. Francis Muhire, go first.
Thank you, Chris. At the moment, as I said, that the global financial system is under a massive change. However much Uganda is a small country compared to the global economy, but still it has to prepare itself and make sure that it keeps afloat regardless of what is happening. But this is what the government has to do. It's about policymakers, decision makers, waking up to reality. And this goes to building resilience, but this resilience is required by one actually ensuring fiscal discipline of the highest level. We need it more than ever before. So the value of money is very important, and the government has to do this, for example, by looking at boosting exports. And how do you boost exports? This is where the question of allocating resources is important. Where are we allocating resources? If, for example, 33% of our tax revenue is going to pay debt, then where are you going to get resources put in critical sectors like education and health? So the most important thing is that the government has to come up with its own measures. We have to stop using the measures or standards that have been put by, let's say, IMF or World Bank or any other development partner. We have to come up with our own local standards where we can put a ceiling and so we cannot go beyond this. So when I'm talking about these measures, we have to stop using measures like debt GDP ratio, tax debt ratio. You need to come and see, for example, how much of your budget resources are you actually allocating to pay debt service. If you're spending over 37% of your budgetary resources on just debt servicing, then you have to know that this is a limit I shouldn't be going beyond.
Okay.
And also to stop thinking that the answers are going to be coming from outside Ugandan boundaries. The answers have to come from here, and we have to sacrifice much. Just as you talked about when you look at the Asian countries, talk about the Asian tigers. What they had to do to build this resilience was actually to have delayed gratification. We have to sacrifice today to make tomorrow a better place for all of us.
Fred Muhumuza, Francis Muhire is effectively saying, how can we control our appetite?
Yeah, I think he's raised some important things. The conversations from internal must continue, and I think that was the key message. The IMF really did us credit and a favor to bring in these ideas for us to continue with the domestic conversations.
That's right.
Because ultimately Uganda must have its own conversation, but has to tap the global knowledge that comes in. And the Economics Forum at the Muhire University Business School, we are committed to really driving conversations across the entire spectrum with Parliament, with the Ministry of Finance, with the rest of government, with private sector, to stimulate these conversations. And we are grateful to NTV that you always provide these platforms. It's going to come out of conversations. Economics is about trade-offs.
That's right.
And the best way to do trade-offs is to understand as many views of the different people as possible, so that you bring them on the table, you hear who is going to be hurt here, how do we help him. So literally for me, the main message is we are going to continue with these conversations. The answers are not going to be final, because this is going to take drastic, serious decisions, but we need everybody on board when those decisions come to be taken and their implications come through.
All right. In the words of one of the great broadcasters of our time, time is not my best ally right now. Many thanks, Fred Muhumuza, for giving us that perspective, and many thanks to you too, Francis Muhire, for the insight on the outlook across sub-Saharan Africa. That is a discussion, it's a discussion that will continue, and of course we shall be emboldened as NTV to amplify any that economists and other stakeholders are up to in ensuring Uganda's economic transformation road is a smooth and clear path.